Corinne, this is your pop, your pawpaw. Corinne, don't go near the fire. Corinne, no. Show Grandma how you do your new toy. Whoa.
I never really believed that they had figured it out.
And I started having some pretty serious health issues.
I wanted to, attribute some of the different issues he'd been having to, side effects of his medication, or maybe he wasn't getting, enough water to drink. Something that we would be able to do something about instead of just having, this disease that we knew was going to progress.
I'd actually been doing some reading about it, and then I felt like a lot of the symptoms fit the Lewy body dementia.
One of them I have is called Lewy body dementia.
I met Papa when I was 14 years old at a church hayride get-together for a youth group with some friends that I had met at camp the summer before. And I really wasn't supposed to go out on a date till I was 16 during that time period. That's what my parents thought, but my mom really liked Papa and thought he had a really nice smile, so she said sure. Pretty much once we started dating, we just continued to date for about 5 years, and we have been married almost 50 years. It'll be 50 years in June.
He was truly the best dad. I think a lot of times, kids, can grow up, looking up to their father and thinking like, oh, my dad, like, he knows everything. And I think as I got older, I realized like my dad, I really felt like my dad really does know everything. I mean, he was just so smart. He is so smart, so hardworking, so generous, so selfless. He was always home by 6 for dinner. I mean, the most I can ever remember Mimi getting upset with him is if it was like 6:10 and, dinner was starting to get cold. I mean, there just aren't enough people like him in the world.
Papa went to law school at Indiana University. He got a job in Huntington, really liked the law firm. It was a small law firm with about 6 or 7 attorneys. Your aunt and your mom were growing up. They were involved in sports activities. Papa was very, very involved. He was a busy attorney, but he always made time to go to your mom's basketball games and all of the different activities.
It's classically a condition that is missed by many physicians because the knowledge of the disease has been poor and the available information has not been great up to this point. The death of Robin Williams and the engagement of his wife in disseminating more information about Lewy body disease has been really important for people's awareness levels.
So Papa had struggled with chronic health issues for years, for decades. He had spent much of his time searching for answers for a diagnosis with doctors local to that region. Now, there were a couple times where they traveled to Rochester, Minnesota, where he had gone undergone some diagnostic work, and this was 30 years ago probably, when he was having kind of some sleep issues, and was diagnosed with severe sleep apnea. He later went probably 20 plus years ago to Cleveland Clinic. He was diagnosed then with myasthenia gravis, which is a neurodegenerative autoimmune disorder. And then for the next, 20 plus years, he was treated with high levels of prednisone, which eventually led to the development of diabetes, which led to the development of more medication, which led to the development of more symptoms. That was just attributed to, it's the myasthenia. I didn't believe doctors had really gotten to the root of what was the cause of most of Papal's pain, both mentally and physically and emotionally.
Well, it was a year this past January that we went to Rush Medical Center. We went over the whole history of how the cognitive issues had been actually going on for a long, long time. Papa is a very, very smart man. He was able to function fairly well because he had learned some coping mechanisms up until right around the time that he had the Parkinson's disease. We know now that the Lewy body probably was already part of the issue.
A lot of times when we go to doctors, we think, okay, we know a little bit, but they know a lot more. And that's actually not the case. A lot of times, whether it's other specialists or ER doctors or nurses, etc., they have very little knowledge about Lewy body. And because of that, really don't know the best way to treat or manage the patients.
And all this time, many thought it was the depression that led to
It was
death.
dementia, Lewy body dementia.
But first, it's been more than a year since actor and comedian Robin Williams died, but new details shared this week by his widow are calling attention to a form of dementia that has received little public focus until now. William Brangham has a story.
After Robin Williams took his own life, his press representative said Williams was battling severe depression. His widow, Susan Schneider Williams, also said back then that he was struggling with depression and early stages of Parkinson's disease. But this week, Mrs. Williams told ABC News and People magazine that an autopsy revealed something else. He had what's known as Lewy body dementia. She described battling a mysterious set of symptoms for a year, something she compared to playing whack-a-mole. Quote, "They present themselves like a pinball machine," she said. "You don't know exactly what you're looking at. I've spent this last year trying to find out what killed Robin because we didn't know. He didn't know."
When I think about how challenging it was for Papa to get a diagnosis, it kind of blows my mind that Robin Williams, this man who has more money than most people on the planet, who for 10 months intentionally sought a diagnosis, who is very, very open, more open than I think most people are about what his entire breadth of symptoms were. He was saying to doctors that diagnosed him with Parkinson's, that should absolutely know how blurred those lines can be in the diagnosis process. And he's saying, do I have schizophrenia? Am I schizophrenic? Do I have Alzheimer's? Is this dementia? Clearly sending a signal, there is something going on in my brain that is not right.
Probably in 2018, I had seen my brother for lunch out, and I remember giving him a kiss goodbye and watching him walk to his truck, and I noticed he wasn't swinging his arms. And that's kind of a hallmark of Parkinson's. And I had noticed even when we were eating lunch together that he was struggling a little bit. And so it was a little bit on my radar, but I think I was denying it. I started hearing from my sister-in-law that he was having some troubles, and He was having trouble remembering, so I went to their house and I did a memory test, because that's something that I do, and I saw that he was having a lot of word finding problems, and so that started a process.
We smoke out in the garage, and I had a lid to my cup sitting on the table out there. Well, he put his cigarette out in that. Now, he is, a very neat person, knows exactly, where things go and everything. Well, I just lit into him. It was like, what? That's my Yeti lid. Obviously, he thought it was an ashtray. And you look back, the walking, he has shuffled for a while.
Well, and we were going to dinner one night. Dad's been driving for 100 years and got confused in where he was. He's grown up in this area his entire life, so it's not new. And he got confused in where he was, tried to back out of a roundabout, and this was years before the diagnosis. Small things like that, you look back in hindsight.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I see that.
It gave his body a release immediately that, oh, here's the Lewy body. This is what you have, and here it is, because it started playing its ugly head almost immediately.
It was a shocker. Didn't think it could happen to me.
Simple things that you just assume that he could do, like turn a light bulb in.
Mm-hmm.
Cannot figure it out how to do it.
And what's sad is he's aware. They know, that they can't do what they're wanting to do, and I think that's what's, to me, the saddest part of it, and for him, the hardest part.
It's the most frustrating
I think,
part.
yeah.
They lose those little things, and that's what happened at work too. I think he was brilliant. He was a brilliant man, and a lot of them are, and they're able to compensate for what they've lost, and not even to themselves. They don't know that they're hiding something, but they compensate, and it's not until it really gets progressed into a diagnostic level that there's truly dementia here. That was all. It wasn't until we had so many symptoms that I was able to research symptoms. And that's when I found the terminology of Lewy body dementia. And the more I read about it, the more I thought, please don't be Lewy body. But on the other hand, once it was confirmed by our neurologist, it was a relief to know what it was.
It tends to be in later life, so after the age of 65, but it's also one of the conditions that can show up as what we call early onset, meaning symptoms occurring prior to the age of 65. It's worth noting some of the nuances of the condition. I'm really not a huge fan of the semantics of how we discuss it, meaning that Lewy body dementia also encompasses both two conditions, Parkinson's disease dementia and another condition called dementia with Lewy bodies. So when we talk about Lewy body dementia, we're technically talking about both of those conditions because they're caused by a mutation in the same protein. I think it's important for people to distinguish between the two because we treat them as separate entities, but they're really on the same continuum. So everybody with Parkinson's disease will eventually get Parkinson's-related dementia if they live long enough. Just like Michael J. Fox has brought up in a recent Vanity Fair article that he started to have some of the cognitive impacts of Lewy body disease with his long-standing Parkinson's disease.
By the time patients are seeking answers or a diagnosis, they have started to develop Parkinsonian-like symptoms. So it could be a tremor, or they could be very rigid, their gait could change. Papa's walk kind of became more of a shuffle. It was like, oh, I'm looking at you, and this physically, as I look at you, looks like Parkinson's. However, they start struggling with things like depression, anxiety, struggling with executive function of, why am I having such a hard time organizing? Why am I forgetting? Why is it so hard for me to stay focused? They might start struggling with things at their job, like things that create shame and guilt and things that are incredibly difficult to open up about, especially when you feel like they're your fault.
The hallucination started of the children out in the bushes, that he sat there saying, I know those bushes can't hold children, but he saw them and they were real. And that's what families have to understand. Those are real to them. What they see is very real. If they see things that are scary, it's real. You can't say no one's there, because they are there. I only had problem once in the whole journey of this, of Tom becoming afraid because there were people in the room that would not leave him alone. And I had him leave the room, and I went into that room and yelled, they should have gone home hours ago, go away, go home. And waited a minute and went and got him. I said, they left. And he believed me.
That's also something that patients might not candidly share because people think they're going crazy.
It's not that person, it's the disease when things go south on them.
I remember that I walked in and he was kind of leaning in the chair. And he looked at me. I smiled and said, hi, you know. He looked at me and he said, so you're going to file for dissolution of marriage? I said, no. He said, I don't believe you. He said, I want to go get that attorney in here. And, you know, I want to talk to him. I want to hear it from them that it's not true. And I said, well, you know, honey, we're at Marco Rehab. As far as I know, there's not an attorney out there. I just couldn't convince him that it wasn't true. And I said, let's just go for a walk and we'll see where we are. He goes, I don't feel like going for a walk. You know, I just kept trying to just convince him, and I couldn't. Maybe it was a day or two later he said something, but then he was like, figured out that it wasn't true and was kind of joking about it.
Classically, we call them hallucinations. They can be of people, animals, misperceiving faces, seeing shadows of things, flitting things out of the corner of the eye, sometimes insects flying around. But they might not be terribly disturbing to that person, and they might think their eyes are playing tricks on them. When they first start, I call them dream hangovers, because that's really what's happening. Lewy body disease is an interesting condition where we're kind of going in and out of the dream state. And as we dip into the dream state, then it lingers on as we awaken. So people's misperceptions often happen right upon awakening. Or if they wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, then they'll see those extra things that aren't there.
He would have dreams, and the dreams would be so real that he was positive that they were real. He was sure that there was these people with guns in our home. And to this day, he still thinks there are people trying to take advantage of us, and they're here almost all the time. He wanted to call the police that day, and he even took his walking stick and went and beat the pillows on the sofa because he saw them sitting on the sofa. And what I finally did to calm him down that day, and I videoed everything in the house. And of course, when he looked at the video, he didn't see him.
We had just about everything. We had catgrass, where sometimes I was Mary, his wife. Sometimes I was Mary, the caregiver. And the doctors would tease and say, how many other Marys? And he'd throw a couple more. And they'd say, are any of them mean to you? He said, no. Another part of it is they always want to go home.
Yeah.
And I would say, does this house not look familiar? He said, oh, it looks just like my home, but I would like to go to my own home now. And what you do is you put them in the car, take them around the block and say, here we are, we're home. And they're fine.
The hallucinations are real to them. And even though you can look out the same window and know for a fact that they aren't there, it's not a productive exercise to confront them with a contrary truth and say like, no, you're wrong, there isn't anybody out there. It's better to be empathetic to what they are seeing, how they're responding to it.
Another characteristic feature is what we call fluctuations. So a person with Lewy body disease, they have trouble with attention and focus. So sometimes they're able to have a great conversation. You're like, wow, they're totally normal today. And then other days, they seem like a space cadet. They're just kind of staring off. It takes them a while for them to comment or to say what they're thinking. And they go through periods of time where their attention and concentration fluctuates. We talked about how they can have those dream enactment behaviors, also known as REM sleep behavior disorder. So that goes on throughout the disease and can disrupt their sleep. And another core feature is what we call autonomic changes. So we talked about how we can do a special heart scan to look at these autonomic receptors, but the autonomic nervous system is really a separate part of our nervous system. So we've got the flight or fight system, known as the sympathetic system, and the rest and digest system, which is completely separate, called the parasympathetic nervous system. And people with Lewy body disease have trouble with that parasympathetic nervous system, where their blood pressure will fluctuate. They'll get really lightheaded when they stand up. Digestion and constipation problems are really common in the condition. So those are some of the other core features.
As the disease progresses and the hallucinations kind of become increasingly present, there's often just also this kind of blurred line between dreams and hallucinations, because it's just one experience simultaneously in a completely different dimension. It's so hard to understand or explain. The brain is just such a bizarre and fascinating and amazing, part of who we are, and it's both, physical in terms of its function, but it's also, there is just this part of our minds that it's so hard to understand and quantify. And I think with Papa, so often there are times people would make comments like, he looks like he's kind of out of it, and they would think he was kind of staring off into space, but I always felt like his gaze was on something. And, now I understand that, as we're sitting in a room with him, still he is still brilliantly smart and competent and has, can have a wonderful conversation. But he also, in his mind, could be sitting in a completely different environment. Like he's seen other people in the room that are strangers or intruders or whatever it may be. He's hearing things that none of us hear. And yet somehow he manages to be present in both places, is amazing to me.
One day he can be talking clearly and walking, and that afternoon he can drop to the floor. He could be very lethargic, very weak. The next day he's fine. That is the hardest thing.
I think of it like navigating a crowded grocery store. If you come in the front door and you need to get to the milk in the back, some of the aisles are going to be so crowded with people, you look at them and you're like, I'm not going down that way. So you find another way to get through to the back of the store. Dad was great with languages his whole life. And like Mom said, was just really, really bright. So I think that gave the grocery store more aisles for him to find alternate paths. Having some empathy as the listeners and realizing the words that are coming out may not be the ones that he was looking for, but they're probably aligned in some way to the message that he's trying to get across. Having a close relationship to them really helps decipher that.
I don't want to use the word confused though, because he knows. He knows what channel he wants on the TV, but he cannot figure out how to get it there.
Yes.
So
Yes.
he's very aware, but it's not being able to play it out in the real world.
Dementia with Lewy bodies, and all of the Lewy body dementias actually, so Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and one other condition called multiple systems atrophy, also known as Shy-Drager disease, are conditions that are created and formed by this protein called alpha-synuclein. And that protein can manifest itself in any area of the brain, but classically it presents in the midbrain, which is the very top layer of the brainstem. And there's a specific area in the midbrain called the substantia nigra, which if you think about the Latin breakdown of that word, it means black substance. It's a very interesting part of the brain because it contains pigment. Just like our skin is pigmented, this part of the brain is pigmented with melanin, just like the rest of our body, like our eyes or our skin. So it's a unique area of the brain that has that pigmentation. And that pigmentation and those cells that create pigment also create dopamine. And so Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, MSA, they all have a lack of dopamine. And so this is the area of the brain where most of those things start. We can get those alpha-synuclein inclusions called Lewy bodies, named after the pathologist Frederick Lewy who discovered them, in any part of the brainstem. And there's a really important part of the brainstem called the reticular activating substance, which is a really important part of consciousness, awakeness, sleep states, and things like that. So that's how those first symptoms can begin. What's unique is that Parkinson's disease always begins in that midbrain, in the substantia nigra. But dementia with Lewy bodies, those alpha-synuclein inclusions, start there, but they also start in the thinking part of the brain, the cortex, at the same time. Whereas in Parkinson's disease dementia, folks might have just the Lewy bodies in the brainstem for 10, 20 years before they eventually spread out into the cortex of the brain, causing cognitive symptoms, those visuospatial changes and fluctuations, the core parts of this disease.
Going back to the early signs, one time we were going to do a simple little electrical repair, switch out a toggle switch. Easy to do. Most homeowners can do that themselves. He backed off and said, I don't remember how to do that. And that was the light bulb in my head that, oh my, this is something he and I used to do all the time.
One thing about Lewy body that has been so difficult to witness, and what makes it also very different and nuanced from some other diseases like dementia or schizophrenia, etc., where there are possible hallucinations, is the trauma of the devastating nature and fear that the hallucinations and delusions often evoke. Every day, Papa fully experiences tragedy, loss, deep fear, trauma. And that's something that I also hope that researchers are working so diligently to understand, because what that does to a person's soul. And that's why there are many suicides that are linked to Lewy body. It rips you apart from the inside out. And to think that, like, sorry. Papa is truly the greatest man. It it just breaks my heart. It's a million pieces. It's so hard. That's what's so hard. There was an urgency to create better treatment options, as there is still not one FDA approved medication for this disease. It's the second most common form of dementia after Alzheimer's, and there is not one FDA approved treatment. And so even the doctors who specialize in this field of medicine are experimenting with our loved ones in hopes of just creating the best quality of care and the best quality of life that they can have. If there's any part of us that feels, whether it's ourself or for our child or our parent or our spouse or our sibling, if there's something that just doesn't feel right, or there's something about a diagnosis that just doesn't seem to add up, or if the dots don't really seem to connect, then they probably don't. And we might not have, obviously, the medical degrees or the education or the training to feel confident in asking questions to doctors who do, but we have to. Because it is on us also to do that in order to move medicine forward.
Like, one thing in the beginning I would say played a big part in good days and bad days was even just getting the medications right, and what cocktail would work for him, and how many times a day versus how much a day, and just doing all of that. And I think we're finally on a good regimen,
yes.
but
Yes,
it took this long to get there.
we just got there last.
And a lot of patients out there
November.
don't know to advocate. Like, no, I don't like this drug. I don't like how this makes me feel. Or it's too much, or it's not enough. And I think
That's why
we're
it's
pretty
so
lucky in that
important
way.
to find a doctor that specializes in it.
There are medicines that they must not be given. It's very, very detrimental. Even Benadryl is bad for them. And my neurologist said, I kind of stay away from medications that have INE in it. That's a no-go for Lewy body. And he also, less is best. Your best medicine for a Lewy body patient is keep them hydrated. Make sure they drink lots of water.
Again, because of this connection to the melanin in the skin and the eyes, we may be able to develop earlier diagnostic tools. In fact, there's already some work being done on skin biopsies to be able to diagnose Lewy body disease, because we can look at those melanin producing cells and look to see if we can see Lewy bodies in the skin. We may also be able to do a special kind of an eye scan that will help us be able to see those Lewy bodies without having to second guess whether they have it or not. There's a lot we don't know yet about who gets Lewy body disease. We do know, and there's been a lot of recent publications about how the incidence of Parkinson's disease and related conditions have been going up a lot. And we don't know why that is. There doesn't seem to be a clear genetic link. We haven't been able to find a gene that we can test people for other than some really rare genes. So it seems to be what we call sporadic. In other words, there's some environmental factor. It's been postulated that it could be something we eat, or a virus that we obtain that's a gastroenteritis virus that might cause the condition. But we're really not sure yet. So we're hoping that we can determine more. I will say that anybody that has head injuries throughout their life, or really catastrophic head injuries, that does make it more likely that they're going to get cognitive changes at a younger age. But as far as we know at this point, it doesn't predispose to getting a condition like Lewy body disease. You may have heard of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, what NFL players and other sports individuals get. They can develop Parkinson's-like symptoms, but it's through collection of a different protein. It's not the protein we see in Parkinson's disease itself.
Okay, honey, that's good. I don't want to be in it.
Let me get a close-up of you, dear.
Don't you dare. You're supposed to be focusing on your granddaughter. it makes me sad. I just, he's my best friend. We've been together over 50 years. I really don't know how to live life without him. And if I think about it, it just is overwhelming. Because I just wonder how I'm going to do it. I mean, even now, when I know that he's not able to necessarily help me process something that's come up, whether it's with bills or if it's with an issue with your mom or your aunt or anything like that, or an issue that I might have, trying to figure out some of the just home administrative type of things that I need to do now that he always took care of. My tendency is to run it by him because I've always run everything by him. So sometimes it's just hard to have to try to figure it out on my own.
I think every day there's something, that is Lewy, that you see happening. It's always changing. You don't know what to expect. There's nothing that...
No warning sign?
No, yeah, it's just very hard to watch your loved one with him knowing that he is not going to get better. It's
just a matter of when.
Right. So we have to be thankful for just being here.
He trusted me. He trusted me with his life. And I realized that. And it was an honor to me that he trusted me to that much.
One of the last things I tell people about this disease is that it is really unique from Alzheimer's, in that whereas in an Alzheimer's dementia, that person may really have a skewed sense of themselves or reality or the people who are there with them. They may know that they care about those people, but they don't know who they are. So it is very different in the end for both conditions. In the end, even in the very, very end stages of this disease, a person with Lewy body disease always knows who are my loved ones in front of me. They'll have these moments of clarity all the way up until the very end where they know what's happening, they know who's around them, and in that sense it's very endearing, and it's a lovely condition because we always maintain some aspect of who we are, even at the very end of the disease.
I went online on Facebook actually and found groups, for Lewy body. And that has been a huge help to me. And makes it, I can get online and read what somebody else is going through. And yes, yes. So that has been a huge help and a huge support.
Yeah.
I think. And I think that's very, very important. And I'm also thankful for my family, that, they're supportive. Abby lives here with us, so it's that's awesome.
She's one of my main support people. And she, and she reminds me to accept the good days. And then there's other things that she says, well, if you can't do it, it's not, like one day I couldn't get him out of bed. And our health aide wasn't coming till 11 something. And he said, and I said, I'm not sure what to do, but I tried to get her to come earlier. She wasn't able to. But I remember my cousin saying, you know what, is he safe? Yes. I gave him something to eat. He was fine. He was comfortable. She says if he has to stay there till 11, has to stay there till 11, So you just, certain things, when people go through things, And they can sometimes have a different perspective and can help you get through it.
He's still dad, and he still has a sense of humor, and he's like, we can't like discount like any of his abilities, because he's always like surprising me. And the other day he was getting up out of his chair, and we've become used to like always having to assist him, but he was getting out of his lift chair, and Mom and I were standing on each side of him getting ready to help him, and then he put one hand down on the side of the chair, and he just kind of like stood himself up. And Mom and I both looked at each other like, did that just happen?
I'm reminded that we're just to live each day and to appreciate each day and to look for the good in each day.
Love you, kiddo. Bye-bye.